been one of the, well, it's sad that we're in this position and I'm seeking positives, but it has, the move to working online has at least enabled us to work when we might be quite far apart together. And we had a perfect example was a session I did for families this morning where we actually had a lady join us from Australia, albeit at 11 o'clock at night when we were all functioning at 11 in the morning. But it has been really lovely to have this sort of connection to people far and wide. So my name's Amanda Edmiston. I'm a professional storyteller based in Scotland, up near Stirling, in a wee village in the countryside. And I have a background in herbal medicine. So I studied plants and plant medicine for a number of years, but then I eventually turned to sharing stories about the plants. For me, the part that really resonated was the old stories, whether it was legends or folk tales from around the world, fairy stories, or little snippets in classic works of literature that were so familiar to so many of us. That really sort of carried the thing I was passionate about plants being used in medicine, in cooking, the way they connect us to the planet and to each other. I've worked with groups from really diverse communities, and one of the things that often acts as a thread of commonality is the way we use plants and the stories that those plants reveal themselves in. A really simple example is the literary fairy tale of Rapunzel. There's a classic Italian version where I can never say parsley, the Latin name. It's a occupational problem, really. But there you go. But it's named for parsley, and in it, Rapunzel or Petronella, I'm going to really regret ever starting that one, bear with me. When her mother craves the plant that she sends her father over the witch's wall to gather, it's parsley. And parsley is used in herbal tradition and herbal practice to bring on childbirth. I imagine a woman caught in that moment of labour where you just want things to hurry up and get moving, craving a plant, even if it meant venturing into a witch's garden to obtain it. It's such a small part of a story, but it's a kind of important part, and it illustrates beautifully the way I use plant stories. I work usually all over the place, all across the world, and I gather these stories from all sorts of different places. The ones where plants and their use becomes an important part of the fairy tale, if you like. But well, then we get to the point where I find myself chatting to Louise, who you've just met down in Worcester. Now, there you go. You know I'm in Scotland. You know I've got this background in herbal medicine. I need to reveal another connection. This is how plants bring people together. There I am, messing around, sharing a story or two online as we start the early stages of lockdown. And I get talking to Louise, and Louise down in Worcester. And I have, well, we have a twist. You see, my grandmother is from a village near Worcester, or was. And during the Second World War, she trained to be a nurse. She then was moved to Bristol, where she took up a post and was stationed on a RAF, near an RAF base, where she met my grandfather. He was from Aberdeenshire, and the pair fell in love and got married and moved back to Aberdeen, where my mother was born, and then me some 40 odd years later. But Worcester's where we went for family holidays when I was little, playing on my great grandfather's farm. learning from my grandmother and my great-grandmother about the plants that grew there, hearing stories warning of the plants in the hedgerow to never touch, to beware the wood bryony or hedgerow nightshade, to watch out for the foxgloves, to never eat this and don't taste that, but also about the plants that I could taste, the plants I could try. I grew up knowing when just the right time to pick a blackberry was, how to combine it with crab apples to make the perfect setting jelly. I learned about putting hawthorn leaves into pieces of bread and butter to make a sandwich, something my grandmother had done as a little girl when food was short and there was nothing tastier to fill her peace. So when I spotted the George Marshall Medical Museum, I kind of wanted to make a connection. And so Louise and I had a chat, and she shared these incredible images that you can find online of some of the items in the collection. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm an absolute sucker for a beautiful box full of tiny plant samples. When I can't get to find some in museums, I tend to make my own. And this is my poisons box, which I'm going to share with you tonight. Now, I'm going to introduce you to some of the items in the collection of the museum as we go along. But the starting point for this evening's session is actually, well, it's with a book. I first met the woman I'm going to introduce you to tonight in the linen soft pages of an ancient herbal in the library of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow when I was creating a workshop for them a couple of years ago. The panelled walls of the library share books from around the world, collected over hundreds of years. There is a copy of Gerard's herbal and Culpeper's herbal, ones that are hundreds of years old. But it was this one book that drew me in the most. A little caption next to it read, "A curious herbal, 500 cuts of the plants used for the purpose of physic. Written by Elizabeth Blackwell, 1737. The first herbal to be published by a woman." I turned the pages. There were virtuous dandelions and notes on their use for liver problems. Cold relieving elderflowers, beautifully depicted. You would have been able to use her herbal to walk into any physic garden, along any hedge-lined path, and recognise the plants therein. I moved on. There were the exotics, cocoa, and her words explaining how it was used as a nourishing drink. Fantastical things from countries around the world, tamarind and turmeric, alongside the more commonplace, the nettles, the apples, the turnips. In amongst those pages, there were also things that really explained how medicine had changed. There were pictures of mandrake roots, that plant that, well, I'll give you a little bit of a clue. Up until that point, mandrake in books like The Hortus, which many people are familiar with the pictures in, is depicted as a tiny, how shall I put this, anatomically correct man-shaped root. And its note will often explain how if you foist it from the earth, it will let out a lethal scream, immediately rendering its assailant lifeless. Elizabeth Blackwell depicts mandrake perfectly. She depicts it in a way that allows whoever reads her book to recognise it. And she does so at a time when cocoa, something that may not exactly surprise those of you familiar with botany, with plants used in medicine, cocoa had only really just arrived in Britain in the early 18th century. It was made popular by one of Elizabeth's mentors, Sir Hans Sloane. We'll come on to him in a bit. It was actually used as a drink before that, but Sir Hans was quite good at picking up on traditional recipes and uses in the countries he worked. Now, how did she become the first woman to publish a herbal? I'm going to give you a little quick history lesson before we free fall into the scarier side of the apothecary's cabinet. She was born to the daughter of a wealthy stocking merchant in Aberdeen around the beginning of the 18th century. That too drew me into her story. I was born in Aberdeen some 270 years later. We shared a hometown. Aberdeen, if you don't know it, is a granite-graced, silver city. It's got an air of rebelliousness. It's always been open to new ideas, as it's the place that sailors often arrive in this land, bringing ideas from around the world. She grew up in a city that, well, in her early years became one of the first to have street lighting and road sweeping. And it was enlightened enough to have just about given up on witch burning, something it had been enthusiastically participating in for the 150 years before then. It's relevant to say that the last witch was tried and executed in Aberdeenshire in 1703, about the same time Elizabeth Blackwell was born. She grew up well educated, we know that much, but at a fairly early age, she fell in love with Alexander Blackwell, her second cousin once removed, a scandalous match. And although Alexander is said to have been very good at languages, he was son of the local dean of Marischal College, one of the earliest universities in Britain. He was also a bit of a blagger. He was prone to making up fictitious stories about himself and his abilities, and so Alexander and Elizabeth eloped. Alexander's reputation was in tatters. He'd claimed to have been trained as a medical doctor, but unfortunately his claims were unfounded. They made their way to London, where Elizabeth, and this kind of gives you a little bit of a clue to this woman's personality, set him up in a printing business. Now, this may not seem like such a small fact, except that in England in that time, there was the law of coverture. What belonged to women was their husband's property on marriage. But Scotland never had this law. In Scotland, what belonged to the wife remained with the wife, and I wonder if the forward-thinking Blackwells stuck to their Scottish roots, because the money he spent, even according to history, which, as you all know, has a tendency to gloss over and change facts as it drifts along, even according to history, it was Elizabeth's money that set Alexander up in the printing business. But hey, you've already got a picture of Alexander beginning to form in your head. And I'm sure he was charming and handsome, and something drew him to the curious but wonderful Elizabeth. But it wasn't his ability to behave authentically. He soon fell into bad times with the printers of London. He hadn't completed an apprenticeship. His reputation was once again in tatters, and he found himself transported to Highgate debtors' jail, penniless, nothing left. And there was our Elizabeth, left looking after her child on her own. Now, bit of a picture here. Middle class women in the 1730s did not work. Pretty much across the board, they didn't work. There are rumours that you couldn't even buy paint without a man's signature. I don't know how true that is, but I do know that what she did next was really quite extraordinary. She took to walking in the grounds of nearby Chelsea Physic Garden, a place our paths crossed once more, albeit hundreds of years apart. When I had my first daughter, before I met the charming John, who you've just met, I started my work as a herbal storyteller, walking in the grounds of Chelsea Physic Garden, fascinated by its collection of plants, which are from every country, nearly in the entire world. In the 1730s, Chelsea Physic Garden was owned by Sir Hans Sloane. This wonderful doctor and traveller, plant collector that had shared the recipe for cocoa, who told of Spanish recipes combining eggs and tomatoes, but more of them in a bit. Sir Hans Sloane encouraged Elizabeth. He introduced her to the head gardener, Isaac Rand, Philip Miller, and the director, Isaac Rand, because Chelsea Physic Garden was already an extraordinary place at that time. It was rented out by Sir Hans to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. And there Elizabeth took to examining the plants and drawing these extraordinary pictures. She also did something that I think is often missed by a lot of people that talk about Elizabeth Blackwell. As I started to uncover her story and work up with Aberdeen University and the National Library of Scotland, as I started to uncover the medical records, something became quite clear. When I went down to Chelsea Physic Garden and I spoke to the staff there, they reiterated my thoughts. Elizabeth Blackwell was an educated, for the time, middle-class woman. She could write, she could paint. She had the notion to provide for herself when women of her era didn't. The historians often claim that the words in Elizabeth Blackwell's A Curious Herbal were written by her husband, Alexander, whilst languishing in a debtor's jail. I suspect that Elizabeth wrote them herself. I think, given that 60 years after Elizabeth Blackwell's work was published, the likes of Mary Wollstonecraft were commenting on women disguising themselves, of lying about their name in order to succeed in a man's publishing deal that they eventually got. I think walking in a physic garden surrounded by apothecaries, plant collectors, doctors and gardeners, that Elizabeth was perfectly capable of writing those words for herself. So there we have it. We have this extraordinary book that I encountered a couple of years ago, and I've been on a journey back up to the town I was born in, Aberdeen, right down to London, to Chelsea Physic Garden. I've shared her story and some of the plants in it at libraries across Britain and other places. And every time I look at a new plant in the Very Curious Herbal project, that, that's named after the book, I do a little more than Elizabeth does. I can't get to, as I start with the plants that are pictured in her book. Her book went on, I hasten to add, to be one of the main sources of reference for doctors and apothecaries at the time. It was given the stamp of validation by the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries and the Royal College of Physicians. It was published originally in weekly, episodic amounts, which meant that not only was it the go-to source of research for the elite and the medically qualified, but that it was available at a low price to a much wider audience. An audience who can never imagine being able to see cocoa or tamarind grow in a garden in real life, but whose knowledge had maybe been taken away from them a little bit as medicine, thankfully, became far more regulated. But it is an interesting shift in the way knowledge was owned, how awareness of plants and the way they could be used was passed on. Something else that's shared in Elizabeth's book. She mentions at one point when talking about acorns that they are used by the vulgar, and she means vulgar in this 18th century term of the common people, not that they were vulgar in any way. But as a plaster, they were ground down and applied to the skin. And so some of the remedies she mentions are like that. They're like folk remedies and old traditions. Some are from leading teaching hospitals like Leiden, and I know she had samples given to her by the gardeners at the University of Leiden. She has information from Culpeper and Gerard, reiterated from older herbals, but she does share an incredible wealth of information in a couple of short paragraphs about every single plant. To over 100 years, a valuable resource for apothecaries and pharmacists. Now, I'll bring you right back up to the present day. I want to tie it into the museum's collection because for this episode very curious project. Also used it to manufacture things for his students, to show them the processes. Because this is a really important time. Most of the things in a chemist's repertoire would have been made in-house still. Now, there are some wonderful things in that box. And although he was working 170 years after Elizabeth Blackwell wrote her book, there are not a lot of dissimilarities. Both contain things pharmacists mention, certainly not in a professional context very often anymore. There is belladonna, that deadliest of things. They always occupy the blue and green bottles. Blue and green bottles were the ones that are all too often marked not to be taken. Not to be taken, because these were the poison bottles kept in the darkest recesses of the apothecary's cabinet. Herbalists still use them carefully today. But I would only go herbalist if you want to find out more about those. Even Elizabeth Blackwell herself, even in 1737, is writing, these should only be taken by the wisest of men. Bear that in mind as we move forward. Give their warning. Bloody fingers. Those folk names. So so conjuring of death and destruction. Dead men's bellows, butcher's thumbs, witches' bells, Scottish Mercury. Names that warn and send shivers down the spine. Those are the many names of the foxglove. Now, many of you, I'm sure, will know that the foxglove, digitalis, digitoxin, is now commonly found and used, especially in the late 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, hugely popular for its ability to control arrhythmia, to stop that uncomfortable, horrible, ill beating of the heart when it suddenly loses its sync. But Elizabeth Blackwell in 1737 makes no mention of foxglove's ability to control the heart. Something happens, something that really illustrates the time she worked in. You may remember, if you weave your mind back to the beginning of my session, how I told you that she was born as the witch trials were coming to an end. They weren't entirely stopped. The law changed so that you were tried for impersonating a witch somewhere about 1735. But up until that point, you could still be charged with witchcraft. And the last witch really wasn't prosecuted for being someone impersonating a witch until the middle of the 20th century. So she's working in a time when medicine was changing quite dramatically. What she describes foxglove as doing I'll read this to you. She describes them as having an incredible ability to work violently upwards. You can imagine what that is. She does, however, add that it's been approved for use in the falling sickness. Now, for those of you that don't know it, the falling sickness in the next century, somewhere later on, becomes known as epilepsy. The falling sickness was pretty much epilepsy. As recently, for Elizabeth Blackwell, as the late 16th century, 1587, it has a slightly more sinister title. In the late 16th century, epilepsy, or the falling sickness, is often described as demonic possession. Now, that's really not a thing that you want to seek medicine for. However, by the time Elizabeth Blackwell is painting her beautiful pictures, her purple and pink, carefully hand-coloured foxglove for the falling sickness, but no mention of its ability to affect the heart. That comes a little while later, in 1785, in a village near Worcester, not so far from the museum. There was a certain Dr. Witherington. Now, Dr. Witherington was not popular in the village. He was absolutely undermined by the local wise woman who kept a beautiful garden, or so it's claimed, full of every kind of plant. She knew how to move things round in beds so that they caught the sun. She could grow plants that were rarely seen in anyone's backyard. And when people came to call, as they frequently did, wanting to avoid the ill-fated hands of Dr. Witherington, she would lead them into her cottage, take them into the kitchen, and then brew them up a cup of tea from the plants that grew in her garden. She had bottles and jars, and she would open them up, and they would be full of redolent herbs. Now, try as he might, Dr. Witherington could not gain a foothold in the village. Very few patients came to see him. But there was one patient in particular that sought his help. A man who complained that his heart was pounding in his chest. He'd fallen out with the old wise woman at the edge of the village and proclaimed her a witch. He said she was malevolent, that she could cause harm as easily as heal, and Dr. Witherington rather liked his words. He was prone to thinking that the woman was dabbling in the dark arts himself. He didn't really trust her out there at all times of night, picking the naughty man's plaything, as it was called, the nettle, grasping them without flinching once and taking them into the house. He would have loved to believe that she was a witch. So the pair got together, and Dr. Witherington tried his hardest to soothe the man's tremulous heart. But he got ashen and his fingers became blue tinged. He said it would pound ferociously at night and the next day would lay like it was flaccid and dying. Whatever he tried, Dr. Witherington could not find a cure. Eventually, the poor man, biting his tongue and stopping his words of witches and demons, went back to the old woman, knowing that she had a cure. And as he went, Dr. Witherington followed him. He followed him and watched as the old woman led him into her kitchen and then came back out, wending her way down the garden path until she found those foxgloves. Butcher's thumbs, bright pink and spotted. She picked a couple of the leaves and took them back inside, and he could see by the candlelight her chop and pound them, mixing them up with water from the hearth. She gave the man a sip, and every day for a week he came back and had a sip more. Dr. Witherington went away. He researched the plant, spotted its name, and experimented and tested. And eventually, finding no favour in the village, decided to move. He moved up to Edmiston, not so very far away, where he became famous and rather well known for his discovery of digitoxin, the extract of foxglove that we use so much in treatment of heart disorders to this day. The old woman, I believe, was never escaped any word of witchcraft. As I say, she was 50 years after the witch trials had ended. I'm very happy to report. But it is an interesting illustrative point of how those slightly more toxic remedies in the apothecary's shop come into use. So we find other plants associated with witches in man's kit. I mentioned belladonna, named Atropa belladonna, after Atropos, the fate who is pictured holding shears, ready to sever. It's ready to sever man from life. Belladonna was used as in a kind of sponge, a sponge that was quite often laced not only with a belladonna but another herb you'll find in Dr. Mann's case. It was often also laced with henbane. Now, henbane and belladonna, quite often with opium, were used instead of anesthesia. You've got to remember that modern anaesthetic, all those lovely things that lull us into a soothing place where we feel no pain once people perform vital operations on us, didn't really, the use of chloroform and ether doesn't happen until the 19th century. And so twilight sleep, as it was known, or early 20th century even, Dr. Mann would have been using plants like that to help anesthetize patients so that they could cope with surgery. Dangerous plants. Hemlock's another one that was often used for its ability to lull the body into sleep. In just 399 BC, we're often told, this is one many people know, the great scholar Socrates was put to death using hemlock. Banquo's insane root. Hemlock causes the body to go slowly numb from bottom to top. And only the most skilled pharmacist, the most skilled anaesthetist would have been able to use this sponge to still the body but keep the heart and brain alive. Plato watched his master Socrates be put to death after he was accused of causing havoc and leading astray the young minds of Athens. And Plato describes his master as becoming still and saying that he felt nothing. He's reported as saying, "When this reaches my heart, I will die, but being calm right up to this moment." The other atropines, the belladonna, doesn't have quite such a pleasant effect. It will leave you as hot as a hen and mad as a hare. It will leave you burning and insane and hallucinating. It's also, of course, got a reputation for being one of the ingredients in witches' flying potions. That's another story. It is still used externally to alleviate joint pain. And this is one of the things that I suspect Elizabeth Blackwell was talking about when she describes its anti-inflammatory pain relieving effects, only used externally. It was used for many years to balance out the ill effects of opium, a dangerous game, as I'm sure you realize. Blackwell describes opium as only safe to be used by the wisest of men. She already knows and can report in 1737 of the damaging effects that this best of anodynes, the most pain-killing of plants, can have. But opium itself has stories that go way, way back to ancient times. It was said to have been given as a gift to Persephone when her daughter was stolen away to the underworld. She searched every mountain, every aspect of the land, hoping to find her child. She was so weary that she could not stop walking. Every bone, every muscle hurt. And eventually the gods took pity on her and gifted her poppies. Poppies that lulled her into the softest of sleeps. Poppies to relieve a mother's pain. Poppies that brought dreams of where her daughter might be. And as I'm sure you all know, she eventually rescued Demeter from the clutches of Hades, where her daughter was dragged back around now as autumn takes its control of the land, and we are all lulled into a soft sleep to dream of spring's return. Poppies and belladonna. But while we're skirting round the atropines at the very back of the apothecary's cabinet, I'd like you to, think on some of the atropines slightly more friendly family members. You see, if you want to get a taste of belladonna, well, a little bit of an essence of danger as Halloween approaches. My best advice is to turn to another of Elizabeth Blackwell's pages. In it, you will find the love apple. Now, Isn't that a lovely name? Aren't you all pleased that something is a love apple? Now, there was huge amounts of disparity in the botanical community at the time. You've got to remember, for those of you who have a little awareness of botany and maybe general science, you might have all heard of Linnaeus, the Swedish cataloguer of names who finds how plants are related. He's working at the same time as Elizabeth Blackwell. So the way we organise plants and how we name them had not yet been set. It still isn't entirely. We still shift from time to time. But in those days, tomato was very, very much at the forefront of the naming problem. Some of Blackwell's peer group refer to it by the name it's got in Latin now. Its Latin name is the wolf peach. Now, it's interesting that Elizabeth Blackwell calls it the love apple because her mentor, Sir Hans Sloane, is one of the first people to talk about eating tomatoes. He brings back this recipe combining eggs and tomatoes in what we would affectionately describe as a Spanish omelette. He picks it up on his travels to the Americas, but it doesn't find a huge amount of favour in Britain, not just yet. You see, pretty much avoided. This is an enlightened woman depicting a tomato, talking about its ability to be used in delicious dishes. This is very much the fashionable new voice to pay attention to, because a lot of Britain in 1737 were still very much convinced of the Northern European legend that tomatoes could be used by witches to turn their enemies into werewolves. You could hand your mortal enemy a tomato and they would be left howling at the moon, not bothering you anymore. They were also believed to be decorative, too close to belladonna to be eaten, and were believed to bring money into the house if you left their blush, purple, red and yellow type sat on the mantelpiece over the fire. Tomatine is it's one of the constituents of tomatoes, and it being in the same sort of type as atropine, the slightly more deadly aspect of belladonna, it can cause what we call in herbal medicine an inflammatory cascade. Something that the storytelling side of me thinks is a little bit like being built up, chemically riled, made angry, left howling at the moon. But she does describe the other atropines. On with me tonight as well. Mandrake, or is that, maybe it's false ginseng, maybe it's wood bryony carved into the shape of a tiny woman holding a baby. I mentioned mandrake at the very start. Mandrake is was again used sometime in an anesthetic situation, but mandrake, as I said, drew so many legends. It was also believed to enhance fertility, but you didn't need to eat it, so I won't bother. And I already had 2 children, 2's enough. All you had to do was sleep with it under your pillow to benefit from its wonderful powers. But you will still find it, even though it's now never found really in the materia medica, you will still find these kind of things. The hemlock and henbane, the belladonna and the foxglove, neat in Alan Mann's case in the museum. Now, that's my little trundle through some of the poisons in Elizabeth Blackwell's Curious Herbal. I'm going to finish off because her husband took a turn, and so we'll come to him at the very, very end of tonight's somewhat dark storytelling. After she'd had her book published, first in these episodic leaflets so that everyone could buy them, even if they were having their knowledge taken away from them, they then could find out more about these incredible plants, coffee and tea coming in from newly, lands that people had not travelled to before, with indigenous knowledge shared by the plant collectors and apothecaries that had discovered them. And then Elizabeth Blackwell talks about them. So I'm off at a tangent. I have a tendency to do that. Her husband. How could I forget Alexander Blackwell? Sometimes I wish I could. You see, she managed to raise enough money with her wonderful book to have him released from Highgate Debtors' Jail. She paid off her debts and raised her children. She was approved by the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries and, as I mentioned, mentored by the great and the good. Her husband, on coming out of prison, announces, however, that he's soon found a new job. You might remember at the beginning, he started off claiming to be a doctor and then a printer. Now, I can almost hear her sigh and roll her eyes. He announces he's got a job as agricultural advisor to the King of Sweden. Yes, I know. I can hear you all shake your heads. Off he went to Sweden. And our Elizabeth carried on working and raising her children alone, but laying plans to go out and join him as soon as she could. Maybe I imagine she was about to start a sort of a Scandinavian volume to match the other two. But as she was about to set foot on the boat and travel out, the news arrived. Alexander had been caught up in a Jacobite plot, 1745, to overthrow the Swedish throne, and had met the harshest cut of all. Not poisoned like Socrates, but executed, head chopped off. There's a legend that says Foxglove sprung out of the neck of a saint as he made his way across Cornwall, I think it is, or Dorset, and he's decapitated, and where the blood comes out, he keeps walking, he gets to his destination. Foxgloves spring up. I don't think the same thing happened to Alexander. Unfortunately, that's where he met his end. And that's about the last we ever hear from history about the wonderful but curious Elizabeth Blackwell, but her book is still there for us to see. She quotes books that you can find in the museum's collection when it reopens. She quotes Gerard and Culpeper. She harks back to Dioscorides and other well-known herbalists of ancient times. But in it, and amongst all those pictures and all that medical knowledge, you will also find the poisons that we no longer talk about.